Diego Ramirez stood at the edge of his small, overgrown garden, staring at the tangle of weeds that had long since claimed victory over the flowerbeds his late wife, Mariana, had once tended with care. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting the white walls of his modest Buenos Aires home in hues of gold and amber. At 38, Diego was a man stretched thin, his days consumed by the relentless demands of his accounting job, the endless cycle of bills, and the weight of raising his 6-year-old daughter, Sofía, alone. 2 years had passed since Mariana's death, a sudden, cruel car accident that had shattered their world, and Diego was still learning how to navigate the void she'd left behind. The neighbors, the school, the world outside his door, they all seemed to watch him with a mix of pity and judgment, their whispers cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Poor man, raising that girl all alone, they'd say at school pickups, their eyes lingering a little too long. Doesn't she need a mother? The question, though unspoken, hung in the air like a persistent fog. Diego wasn't blind to the scrutiny. He saw it in the sidelong glances from the mothers at school meetings, in the overly polite smiles of teachers who asked if Sofía had someone else at home to help with her homework or braid her hair. He did his best to God. He tried. He cooked dinners, though they were often burnt or bland. He tied Sofía's curls into lopsided ponytails, ignoring her giggles at his clumsy efforts. But it wasn't enough. The world demanded more, a polished image of stability, a family that looked whole, even if it was just for show. Diego wasn't naive. He knew a single father with a messy house and a daughter who sometimes wore mismatched socks didn't fit the suburban ideal. He needed help, not just for Sofía, but for the sake of silencing the whispers, for crafting an illusion of order that would keep the world at bay. That's when the idea struck him. A neat +A nanny. Someone who could step into their lives, tidy up the edges, and present the picture of a functional household. Not a replacement for Mariana, and no one could be that, but a professional, someone who could handle Sofía's school pickups, her meals, her tantrums, and maybe even charm the nosy parents into leaving him alone. He posted an ad on a local job board, carefully worded, "Se buscan ni a tilde plus minus air para ni a tilde plus minus a de 6 a tilde plus minus os, horarios flexibles, preferablemente alguien con buena presencia." The last part felt shallow, but Diego justified it. If he was going to play the part of a put-together father, he needed someone who could sell it to someone poised, polished, the kind of person who could walk into a school event and make everyone else feel at ease. The responses came quickly, a flood of emails from eager applicants. Most were unqualified or uninspiring students looking for quick cash, older women whose copyright copyright s felt too rigid for Sofía's spark. Then came Clara's application. Her email was brief but thoughtful, accompanied by a photo of a woman in her late 20s with warm brown eyes and a loose braid that framed her face like an afterthought. Clara Daz, a part-time art teacher, had experience with young children and a degree in early childhood education. Her cover letter mentioned a love for storytelling and a knack for turning tantrums into laughter. Diego skimmed her credentials, but it was the photo that sealed it. She looked kind, approachable, the kind of person who could win over a room without trying. Perfect for the appearances he needed to keep up. He called her the next day, and they met at the small cafe copyright near his office. Clara arrived in a flowered blouse and jeans, her braids slightly messier than in the photo, a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled easily, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and Diego felt a pang of relief. She wasn't stiff or overly formal, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she could handle whatever chaos Sofía might throw her way. They talked for an hour about Sofía's love of animals, her stubborn streak, her habit of hiding under the dining table when she was upset. Clara listened intently, jotting notes in a small sketchbook, and when Diego mentioned the school's prime parents, she nodded knowingly. "I get it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You need someone who can make things like a broken bar together." "I can do that." Diego hired her on the spot, offering a generous hourly rate and a schedule that would have her at the house most afternoons and evenings. He explained that Sofía needed structure, homework help, meals, bedtime routine as but he was careful not to mention the deeper truth, that he was drowning, that Sofia's silences worried him, that he didn't know how to fill the space Mariana had left. Clara didn't press for details, only nodded and promised to start the following Monday. As she left the cafe told to copyright, her tote bag swinging lightly against her hip, Diego felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe Clara could be the bridge between the life he had and the one he needed to project. The first week, however, was a disaster. Sofia, with her sharp intuition and fiercer loyalty to her mother's memory, was not easily won over. She greeted Clara with a scowl, her small arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I don't need a babysitter," she declared on the first afternoon, her voice edged with defiance as she sat on the living room floor, surrounded by a fortress of stuffed animals. Clara, unfazed, knelt beside her and offered a smile. "I'm not a babysitter," she said. "I'm just here to hang out. Want to show me your favorite toy?" Sofia's eyes narrowed, and she turned away, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Gonjo, as if it were a shield. Diego watched from the kitchen, his stomach twisting. He'd hoped Sofia would warm to Clara instantly, that her presence would magically smooth over the cracks in their little world. But Sofia was stubborn, her grief a quiet undercurrent that surfaced in moments like these. She missed her mother's voice, her songs, the way Mariana would braid her hair while whispering stories about faraway lands. Diego tried to fill that role, but his bedtime stories were clumsy, his voice flat from exhaustion. He'd read from picture books, stumbling over words, or make up tales about pirates that always seemed to end abruptly when he ran out of ideas. Sofia would listen politely, then roll over and hug Gonjo, her silence louder than any complaint. Clara, to her credit, didn't push. She spent that first week trying different approaches, offering to bake cookies, suggesting games, even pulling out her sketchbook to draw with Sofia. But Sofia remained a fortress, her responses monosyllabic, her eyes darting to Diego as if seeking permission to dislike this intruder. Diego, meanwhile, was fielding his own challenges. At the school's open house that week, Clara accompanied them, her presence a carefully orchestrated signal to the other parents. She wore a neat blazer and skirt, her braid tamed into a sleek bun, and she chatted easily with the teachers, her laughter light and disarming. The mothers, who had once whispered about Diego's solitary state, now smiled approvingly. "She seems lovely," one said, her tone laced with relief. "Sofia's lucky to have her." Diego nodded, forcing a smile, but inside he felt an gnawing unease. Clara was playing her part perfectly, but Sofia's coldness was a reminder that appearances were only half the battle. By the end of the week, Diego was ready to call it quits. He sat Clara down in the kitchen after Sofia had gone to bed, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee. "I don't think this is working," he said, his voice heavy. Sofia's note a broken bar connecting. "I thought she'd warm up by now." Clara tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "She's testing me," she said simply. "Kids do that when they're scared of letting someone in." "Give it time." Diego wanted to argue, to say that time was a luxury he didn't have, but something in Clara's steady gaze stopped him. She wasn't pleading for the job, she was speaking from experience, from a place of quiet certainty. Against his better judgment, he agreed to give it another week. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening, when Diego was stuck late at the office, crunching numbers for a client who'd missed a tax deadline. Clara was alone with Sofia, tasked with getting her through dinner and bedtime. When Diego called to check in, Clara's voice was calm but tinged with excitement. "Don't worry," she said, "we're having an adventure." He didn't press for details, too exhausted to question her optimism, but when he arrived home just before 9, he found the living room transformed. Blankets were draped over chairs, creating a makeshift tent, and inside, Clara and Sofia sat cross-legged, surrounded by crayons and a notebook filled with colorful scribbles. Diego paused in the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, as Clara's voice carried through the room. She was telling a story, her tone animated, her hands gesturing wildly. "And then," she said, "the princess realized her dragon wasn't just green up, it was every color of the rainbow, and when it flew, it painted the sky with sparkles." Sofia, usually so reserved, was leaning forward, her eyes wide, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "What happened next?" she asked, her voice soft but eager. Clara handed her a crayon. "You tell me," she said. "Draw the next part, and we'll make it up together." Diego's throat tightened. He hadn't seen Sofía this engaged in months, maybe years. She was sketching furiously, her small hand moving with purpose, narrating a story about the princess and her dragon escaping a storm. Clara listened intently, nodding and adding details: a castle in the clouds, a villain who turned out to be a lonely wizard. When Sofía yawned, her eyes heavy, Clara didn't rush her to bed. Instead, she tucked the blanket around her and continued the story in a softer voice, guiding Sofía to a gentle ending where the princess found a home in the stars. By the time Sofía was asleep, her head resting on Concho inside the blanket fort, Diego was still standing in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. Clara glanced up, her smile quiet but triumphant. She gathered her things and stepped into the kitchen, motioning for Diego to follow. "She's okay," Clara whispered, her eyes bright. She just needed a way to let her guard down. Diego nodded, unable to find words. He wanted to thank her, to ask how she'd known exactly what Sofía needed, but all he managed was a mumbled, "You're good at this." Over the next few weeks, the blanket fort became a nightly ritual. Clara brought her sketchbook, and she and Sofía invented new stories: tales of mermaids who swam in rivers of stardust, of foxes who could talk to the moon. Sofía's silences grew shorter, her laughter louder. She started asking for Clara in the mornings, wondering what adventure they'd create next. Diego watched from the sidelines, grateful but uneasy. Clara was more than a prop for appearances now. She was becoming a fixture in Sofía's world, someone who could reach her in ways he couldn't. He wondered if he was failing her, if his love was somehow less because it didn't come with crayons or stories that made her smile. One night, as Clara packed her bag to leave, Diego stopped her. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his voice low. "The stories, the drawings, you don't have to go that far." Clara paused, her hand on the strap of her tote. "Because she needs it," she said simply. "Not me, not the school, not the numbers. She needs someone to listen, to make her feel safe enough to dream again." She hesitated, then added, "You're doing your best, Diego." "But she's carrying a lot for a 6-year-old. Let me help." Diego didn't respond, but her words lingered long after she'd gone. He sat by Sofía's bed that night, watching her sleep, her small hand still clutching a drawing of a rainbow dragon. The house felt quieter, warmer, as if Clara's presence had softened its edges. He realized then that he'd hired her for the wrong reasons: to quiet the world's judgment, to polish his fractured life. But Sofía hadn't needed a nanny for appearances. She'd needed someone to sit with her in the dark, to weave stories that made the world feel less heavy. And Clara, with her messy braid and her endless patience, had known that from the start.